In this class, we're going to start setting up controls for the eyes to control eye direction, and we're going to rig the eyebrows for facial expressions. So we'll start by creating a control curve for eye direction. Now normally for 3D character rigs, there's an outer ring to control both eyes, and then we have two small circles inside the outer ring to control each eye direction individually. So let's go to our curves and surfaces shelf, and we'll click on the NURB circle, and it comes in at the origin. Let's bring it up and out. And we're going to rotate that in X 90 degrees. You can rotate it manually, but to be precise, let's just type in 90 degrees in the rotate X attribute. We're going to hit the spacebar for our marking menu, and we're going to right click, and we're going to go to front view. You can hit F on your keyboard to focus in on it. Just zoom out a bit, and let's just scale it out a little bit. Usually they're shaped in sort of an oval shape. That's usually the way you see most character rigs. Use your scale tool and your move tool just to position it right in front of the eyes. And I'm just going to shape this one a little bit, just for aesthetics. Go to show and turn off our polygons, and we'll go to show again and turn off our joints, just so we don't select them by accident. And I'm going to press F8 on my keyboard to switch to component mode. And then we can select multiple CVs and scale them. And then I'll press F8 to get back into object mode, and I'll turn my polygons on again. We can leave the joints off, we don't really need them on for this lesson. Alright, so we don't want it too close to the face, and we don't want it too far away either. So something like that is probably fine. We'll be able to move this control curve to animate both eyes moving together. So let's create two new control curves that we can use to control each eye individually. So I'll go back and I'm just going to create another curve, and we're going to move it and scale it into place. Doesn't really matter how big it is, just as long as it fits inside that outer ring. And it doesn't have to be directly in front of the eyeball. You can place it anywhere really. And then I'm just going to use Control D on my keyboard to duplicate it, and we'll just move the second copy over. Alright, so now I'm going to do what we always do when we create new control curves. We're going to go to Edit and Delete by Type, and we'll delete history on each one. And we'll go to Modify and Freeze Transformations. We'll do that for each one of these new control curves. So now the next step is to name them. So we'll name this one right eye control, left eye control, and I'll just name this one eye direction control. So the next step is to constrain these controls to the eyes. I'm just going to select the eye geometry so I can find it here in the hypergraph, and we'll go into the hypergraph. We'll hit F to focus in on it just so we can find it, and just zoom out, and we can see that we have our left eye group and our right eye group. Now these are already constrained. These already have a parent constraint on them, and they're constrained to the head. So I don't want to use this group to constrain. We're going to create a new group, and if you remember, we have 3 different pieces for each eye. So we're just going to drag a box over these nodes, and we'll hit Control G on our keyboard to make a new group. And you can see that the parent constraint for the old group goes right underneath the right eye group. So now we have a new group with all the eyeball pieces underneath it. So we'll just name this new group, we'll name it Right Eye Aim Group. So we're going to use this group node to constrain our eyes to the controls. And let's just do the other one too while we're at it. We'll just select the pieces, the 3 pieces underneath the group and not the constraint, and Control G on our keyboard. And we'll name this one Left Eye Aim Group. If we select these new groups now and we zoom out, we can see that the pivot point is down at the bottom here. So we need to center the pivot point before we apply the constraints. We'll do the left eye first. So with the Left Eye Aim Group selected, we'll just go to Modify, and we'll select Center Pivot. Then we'll just do the same thing with the right eye. Select it, Modify, and Center Pivot. Now we can apply our constraints. Do the right eye first. We'll select the right eye control and the right eye aim group, and we'll go to Constrain, and we're going to use an aim constraint. So go to the option box for a minute and make sure that Maintain Offset is checked, and then we'll click on Add. So let's just test it. Select the right eye control, W on the keyboard, and let's just move it back and forth and make sure it works. And it looks like it's working properly. Now we'll do the same thing with the left eye. We'll select the left eye control first and the left eye aim group. We'll go to Constrain. We already know the Maintain Offset is checked, so I'm just going to click on Aim and we'll test it. Should really test it in all directions. That's working fine. Alright, so now we need to attach the main eye direction control to each eye. So we have to do them individually. So we'll select the eye direction control first, and let's start with the right eye. We'll shift select the right eye aim group. And then we'll go to Constrain and click on Aim Constraint. So we're going to do this over again. We're going to select the eye direction control, and then we'll select the left eye aim group. And we'll do the same thing, go to constrain and aim. So now let's test that. And they all move together nice. Now we need these individual eye controls to move with the master eye control. So we're going to do the same thing we did with the other body controls. We're just going to parent them together. So with that selected, let's just hit F on our keyboard to find it here in the graph editor. So we can select both the individual eye controls first, so that they're going to be the child, and we'll select the eye direction control last, so that'll be the parent. We'll hit P on our keyboard. So now if we select the master eye control, the eye direction control, the individual eye controls go with it. And you can move the eyes individually as well. Alright, so let's just select all those and set them back to 0. Alright, next we're going to rig our character so that he can blink. Let's go to show and just turn off our control curves. So we'll go to NURBS curves and just uncheck that so we don't see them anymore. And let's turn off the eyes as well. We have the eyes on a layer here. Let's just click that so we don't see the eyes. And I'm going to turn the hair off too, just to get it out of the way. Alright, so to get the character to blink, we're going to be using a deformer called a cluster. So make sure you're on your rigging menu set. And let's select the character, and we're going to right click and go into object mode, select vertex. I'm just going to select a couple of vertexes here just so I can hit F and focus in on the eye area. Just so when we orbit around, we're orbiting right around the eye. And I like to get inside the head to do this. And I like to use my lasso tool for this. So we'll go to our toolbar, right underneath the selection tool, we'll click on the lasso tool. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to attach a cluster to a group of vertices. So I like to select a little bit more than what I need, because we're going to paint cluster weights to get the eye to close. So let's select a section of vertices that encompasses the whole upper eyelid. And again, I like to select more than I need. So I'm going to go right up to the eyebrow. You have to sort of get a good angle on it, get a good selection. We are going to have to go back and adjust our selection using shift to unselect some of the vertices and holding shift down to select more of the vertices. Alright, so we'll just make a selection here, and I'm going to go to my selection tool. And I'm just going to hold shift down and deselect some of these. Some of these I really don't need. I know I'm not going to need this row of vertices for the upper blink. So I'm just going to go back inside. We can hit 4 on our keyboard to go to wire mode. Makes it a little bit easier to see all the vertices that we have selected. And you can just drag a box, hold shift down and drag a box to deselect some of these that we know we're not going to need. You don't want to have too little, because then some of the skin won't come with the blink. So something like that is probably fine. You definitely want to make sure you get the corners here. So now that we have our selection, we're going to go to deform, and we're going to choose cluster. Let's go to the cluster option box for a minute. And we want to make sure that we have relative checked on for the cluster, and then hit create. Alright, as soon as you do that, you'll see this tiny little C, and that's our cluster. All the vertices that we selected are now attached to this cluster. So if we hit W on our keyboard and just try to move it, you can see that that whole selection just comes with the cluster. But of course we don't want something like that. We want to be able to blink this eye, so we're going to paint weights on this selection so that we get a nice smooth deformation. So let's do a rough weight painting on this cluster, and then we're going to make a couple of other fine adjustments. But before we go ahead and do that, let's rename this cluster so we know what it is. I'm going to leave the word cluster in there, and I'm going to call this left eye cluster. Alright, so if we select the mesh and we go to deform again, here's where we create the cluster, and down below near the bottom here under paint weights we have a cluster weight painting tool. So we'll click on that, and now you can see we have, just like when we did the skin weighting, we have a visual representation of the cluster weight in white, and our cluster weight painting tool is here in our toolbar now. So we'll double click on that. So this is very similar to painting weights when we're doing the skin weighting for the joints. There's a couple of small differences here though with the tool. So you can see our brush looks very big here. So we can control the radius here under radius. I find that it comes in at 3. I'm going to put it at about 1.5 maybe, or 2. 2 is probably a pretty good size for now. And well, as we're painting weights, we're continuously changing the size. And then here we have a more gradient brush, and this brush covers a larger area. And then under paint attributes, you can see that we have our left eye cluster. This is what we named it just a second ago. If you just left click here and go to the flyout window, this is our left cluster, and as we create more clusters, they'll be included in a list here. So we can switch, when we have the mesh selected and we're painting cluster weights, we can easily switch between which cluster we want to paint. So the add is relatively the same. This adds more weight to the cluster. You can see here that already by default it has a maximum weight distributed throughout the entire selection that we originally attached the cluster to. So what we're going to want to do is choose replace, and that takes weight away. So right now we need to just take weight away from this cluster. So if we go to replace and you just left click and paint over the selection, we'll take weight away. This is why we made a selection a little larger than the area that we needed, just so we can create a nice gradient of weight. So we'll just paint over that. And this is just going to be rough for now. Don't get too picky with it because it's going to be adjusted in a few minutes. We just want to get something rough. So I'm going to switch my brush. And when you're on replace and you're taking weight away, you can drag this slider up. You can see it actually it's adding weight to the area now. So if you want to completely take weight away and make this all black, indicating that it won't go with the cluster at all, you drag it right to 0 under replace. It takes the weight completely away, which is actually what I'm going to do right now. So I'm just going to go around the perimeter here, and I'm just going to keep it to the eyelid. I'm going to go inside the head because I have all this extra geometry here that I don't really want to go with the blink. I'm just going to take all the weights away from this area here. Alright, so I think I'm going to crank up value just a little bit. I want to take more weights away from this area, but I don't want to have it completely black. I don't want to remove all the weights. I just want like a medium amount of weight in this area, just so that the lid closes nice and smoothly. Okay, so now we can go to smooth, our smooth option. Now we can go ahead and just continuously paint to smooth out the areas here, but I'm just going to use the flood button, and that'll flood the whole area with the smooth function. So if I click it once, you can see it smooths it out a little bit. You can keep clicking it to increase the amount of smoothness. Something like that. I just want to make sure I take weights away from this area. I'm just going to refine my weights a little bit. So I want to make my brush a little smaller. I'm going to go back to replace, crank it to 0, and I want to take weights away from this area here. Alright, so let's just see how this worked out. This is sort of rough for now. We're going to have to go back and refine this in a few minutes. So I'm just going to hit my selection tool and just click out in space here to exit the paint function. Let's select our cluster here, the graph editor. So the way we're going to blink the eye is to rotate the cluster. And you can see here that it's not really working out very well. What we're going to do is move the pivot point of the cluster back so that it rotates a little bit more naturally. Spacebar and right click. Let's go to the right view for a minute. And we're going to move the pivot point back toward his temple a little bit. So let's press D on the keyboard, or you can hit the insert button. I'm just going to hold D down and move the pivot point back. Now this is something that we have to sort of experiment with a little bit to see where it works best, but you don't want to move it up or down. I would just move it back in Z. So now if we rotate it in X, more of a natural looking blink. And just to see the difference, you can hold D down again and move it back much further to see what the result is. Or if we move it closer and try that, you can see it sort of folds in on itself when it's too close. So we'll move it back. It might be different on your character if you're rigging a different character. If you hit the plus sign on your keyboard, you can increase the size of your manipulator, and that might give you a good idea of how it's going to react. I'm just going to put that manipulator back to where it was. It's always a good idea to turn on the eye to see how it's covering the eye. Let's go back to our perspective view for a minute. It's covering the eye fine, there's no intersections, maybe a little bit there. So if you find when you close the eye and you see there's an intersection there, you might want to move the pivot point of the cluster forward or backward. You want to make sure that your rotation is set back to 0 before you move the pivot. So if I hold D down on my keyboard, I can do this right in perspective view as well. If we hold D down and I move it back a little more in the Z axis, and now if I try and rotate it, so now I don't have that intersection. So it's just a matter of testing and seeing how far back you need to move the pivot point. So we'll put that back to 0, and I think that's working out pretty well. We just need to paint the cluster weights a little bit on the eyelid so that we get a nice rounded form here. So we'll do the same thing we did when we were painting weight for the joints. We'll just move it into a posed position and then see if we can paint that out a little bit. So let's select the polygons, and we already have our paint cluster weights tool activated in our toolbar, so I'll double click on that just to get our tool options back up, and now we can start refining the cluster weights. So I can see already we need to add a little bit more to the middle and take away a little bit from the corners of the eye. Turn the eye off just so it doesn't get in the way, and I'm going to go to add and turn it up a little bit and just start painting that area. Again, don't be afraid to just go really rough because we can smooth it out later. So I'm just alternating between adding, smoothing, and replacing. I'm going to see if I can get the corners back up just by smoothing it. And then for the corners, you might choose to decrease your brush a little bit. Right now I have it at 1, so I'll set it to maybe 0.7 or 0.07. If I'm using replace and I have it on 0, it's going to completely take weights away from this area. Try and use smooth first, just so it smooths it out a little bit. It will take weight away from that area. Smoothing just sort of evenly distributes the weight. Alright, so while we're on smooth, we can try flooding it again. It's basically averaging all the weights together in the whole area. So that's working out. Sometimes you have to smooth specific areas by hand. I usually take a lot of time to put a lot of care into this because in any animated production we see the character's face a lot. So we want to make sure that all the face deformations are looking really nice. Just going to hit Q on my keyboard for the selection tool and click out into space. And then we can select our cluster and we can go to the rotate X attribute in the channel box, and we can middle mouse button now. Just use the middle mouse button to virtual slide and test that blink out. I'm just going to get it real close to the bottom here and just go in and adjust the weights so that it closes nice and tight so we don't have any gaps here. So again, we'll select our mesh, double click on the paint cluster weights tool in the toolbar. So we're going to add some over here, we're going to add some over here, and then we'll smooth it out again. So at this point, because I'm making finer adjustments, and I sort of want to be careful and not to mess things up too much, with our add function activated, we can just turn the value down a little bit. You'll find the slider is really touchy, so you might want to punch in a number here. So I'm always flipping around between the outside and the inside just to make sure the mesh is doing what I'd like it to do on both sides. And that way we'll get a more even smoothing when we go to smooth it out. So I'm going to go to replace and crank it all the way down to 0. And now we can go and just take weights out of certain areas. It is believable that some of the skin might move a tiny bit near the eyebrow, so maybe not so high. So just under the eyebrow I'm going to completely remove any weights. And perhaps right at the corner of the eye, we might want that to stay put. And let's flood it with some smooth. We'll just click on smooth and we'll just flood that. So just smooth that a couple times. If you flooded too many times, you can always hit Control Z on your keyboard to undo. So the corners of the eye sometimes are a little bit problematic, so you might want to manually smooth those yourself. I'm going to go back to replace and just get rid of the weighting again around the nose. You might not want to completely remove some of the weighting around the corner. You might want the corner just to move a little bit. It's kind of nice to have that happen. When you get to these more delicate areas, you might want to decrease the size of your brush. Just go with a very small value on add. It's very similar to when we do the corner of the mouth as well. It's just a very touchy area, and sometimes it gets down to making your brush so small that you're only affecting one vertex. So I can see in here, right in this area, I'm probably going to want to affect that one vertex, so I'm going to make my brush super small just for that little tweak, and just use a very small amount of adding, a very low value of adding, just to refine that one little area. So I'm going to go to a value of 0.01, and I just want to tweak that vertex out a little bit. There, and I'm just going to leave that just how it is. Alright, and I'm probably going to smooth this area out by hand. We'll go to our smooth function. I'm not going to go to that area. I want that vertex to stay right where it is, right in that crease. And we'll bring our brush up to 2, and we're just going to smooth out this whole area a little bit. Okay, and I can see I have a tiny little gap here, so we're just going to pop out a couple of these vertices with our add function on a very low value setting, and I'll turn our brush up a little bit. We'll increase the size of our brush a little so I can affect 2 or 3 vertices at a time. I'm just going to pop these out a little just to get that eyelid to close. And we'll go to our smooth function and just smooth that out. I'm just sort of clicking on individual areas just to pop them back and get a nice rounded form. Again, with smoothing, if you find it's smoothing it out too much and it's putting it back to where it was, you can crank the opacity down with the smooth function turned on, and it'll smooth less. It'll just smooth it a tiny bit. So I can see, for example, this vertices, it's not giving us a very nice edge flow here, so I want to pop that down a little bit. And I got my opacity down, so it's not doing it too much. But we can just pop those down a little bit just to give us a nice edge flow and a nice deformation, and it'll be a nice look when it's complete. I think that's looking pretty good. Let's take a look. We're just going to hit Q on the keyboard and click out in space here. Let's select our cluster. Go to our Rotate X attribute in the channel box. Let's turn our eyeballs on again. And we'll middle mouse button drag on the Rotate X. So we also want to check what it looks like when the eyes open really wide. It will get to a certain point where the polygons will begin to intersect each other. That's natural. Obviously we won't set the control to go that high. So that's working out really well. You just want to make sure that you can get the eye closed completely without any gaps. And by rotating the cluster and the Rotate Z, we can get the eyelids to give us an angry or sad, tired expressions. And we'll work that into our attributes. But this is just an extra bonus advantage that we get just out of this one cluster. Alright, so we'll just zero that out, and I'm going to repeat the process on the other eye and get the other eye to blink as well. And then we're going to set up our eyebrow controls. Okay, so I've gone through and created a cluster for the right eyelid as well, and I've painted the weights, the skin cluster weights, and now we have both eyes rigged for blinks, and we can open his eyes pretty wide too. Okay, so now that we have more than one cluster on our character, if we click here in the Paint Cluster Weights tool where it says right eye cluster, right now we have the right eye cluster selected, and you can see that it's showing us the weights. But if you click on it and you hover over the word cluster here, you can see that we have left eye cluster weight and right eye cluster weight. So this is how we can switch between clusters if we want to go back and forth and paint a little bit on the right and a little bit on the left. Because we're going to have quite a few clusters on our character when we're finished. Right now we just have 2 for the eyelids, but we're going to create some for the eyebrows as well, and probably some for the mouth. So I'm just going to hit my selection tool, click off in space here. Alright, so let's create some for the eyebrows. For the eyebrows, we're going to have one cluster for the inner eyebrow, one cluster for the mid eyebrow, and one cluster for the outer eyebrow. This will allow us to move and rotate the inner, mid, and outer eyebrow to get any facial expression that we might need. So we'll turn the eyes off. So we're going to right click and choose vertex, and we'll go to our lasso tool again, and it's very similar to how we selected the vertices for the eyelids. So I'm going to do the left eyebrow here, and then we'll repeat the same process on the other side. So I'm going to go inside the head. Let's do the inner eyebrow first. When we move the control for the inner eyebrow later on, we want it to affect this whole area of his head. So I'm going to select a larger area than I think I need, just so that we can paint out the area around it. So the cluster is going to move the inner part of the eyebrow the most, but I want it to cascade out to other areas. We're going to make a pretty large selection here, and we're going to do this for every part of the eyebrow. Okay, so I'm going to refine my selection a little bit. And you have to think about, if we push the inner eyebrow down, we probably want it to fold into the eyelid a little bit. And it's okay, you can overlap clusters. So for example, we have a cluster that's affecting some of these vertices in the eyelid. You can also have another cluster affecting the same vertices. Alright, so I think I'm going to go with this selection here. It's a good idea to hit 4 on the keyboard to go to wireframe and just zoom out and make sure that you don't have anything selected back here like that, for example. And we're going to go to deform, and I'm going to create this cluster. And here it is in our hypergraph. So I'm just going to rename that right now. I'm just going to call it left inner brow cluster, and if we move that up and down, you'll see that the entire selection comes with it. So we want this area to be the real hot spot, bright white, and then we'll have the weights drop off as it gets farther away from the inner part of the eyebrow here. So I'll select the mesh, double click on the icon here in the toolbar, and now if we click on here under paint attributes and we go to cluster, we can see we have a left inner brow cluster. So we can switch to that one, and I'm going to go to replace. First thing I want to do is just get rid of some of the weights around the perimeter here. So I'll go to replace, drag that all the way to 0, and we're going to have to increase our brush size a little bit. So let's just go to maybe 2 for now. And I have my opacity at half It's nice to keep dragging this up and down as you need it. So I'm going to just leave it all the way at 0 because I want to completely get rid of some of these weights here. I'm going to use the smooth flood option later on, so it'll actually put some weights back in these areas. So I'm just going to take weights away completely from the edges. Alright, I'm going to drag my opacity down to about 2/3 of the way. Let's just smooth flood that. And let's move the cluster. I'm going to select the cluster now and let's move it up and down. Alright, so that's looking pretty cool. We're going to do something very similar to what we did with the joints, where we move the cluster into a position and then we paint it out to get the desired deformation that we want. So I'll do that with moving it up and moving it down. For these clusters, we're basically just going to be moving them up and down, and we'll also be rotating them. Alright, so I'm just going to move this down to get them into more of a sort of an angry expression, and we'll paint this cluster out, and we'll start finessing the weights to get some nice deformations. Alright, so that's good for now. I'm probably going to have to revisit that, but it looks a little bit better underneath here. I'm just going to bring this cluster up now. We want to get as much exaggeration as possible without breaking the skin apart. The key is to get the weighting to a point where it looks good when we bring it up and when we bring it down. So right now I have all this stretching happening. I really don't want to have that there. So we have to work on this a little bit by adding weight, getting rid of some of the weight in certain areas, and then smoothing it out. So I'm just continuing to add weight in certain areas just to have it pop up a little bit more, and then smoothing the areas out. It's nice to turn your opacity down when you go to smooth out so you don't smooth too much, and then sometimes you're not smoothing enough like that, so I want to turn my opacity up a little bit just so it has a bigger impact when I click and drag over that area. I'm going to do one for the outer brow, and then we'll do the mid brow. The outer brow, really, we don't use it too much, because if you look in the mirror and move your eyebrows up and down and create any facial expression you can with your brows, the outer brow really just comes along for the ride. Most of the muscle in your brow area is concentrated near the inner and mid area, and really most of the muscle is in this general area. You can't independently move your outer eyebrow up and down or in any direction. We'll still create a control for it, because there's times when you do need to repose it. It's just good to have that control there in case you need it. Sometimes you're just using it as a fix. So we're going to select the mesh and go to vertex. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to select an area with our lasso tool. We'll select an area a little bit larger than we think we need. Alright, so I'm going to tap 4 on the keyboard to get in the wireframe. Make sure I don't have any vertices selected near the back of the head or anywhere where I don't want to. And let's just apply the cluster. So we'll go to deform, create cluster, and let's name this one right away. Left outer brow cluster, and let's just select the mesh and go in and paint weights on it. You can see how our inner brow cluster ended up looking with the weights. Very heavy in the area where we want it to move the most, and then it just sort of degrades out. So we'll do the same thing with the outer brow. Let's actually try and get it like that right off the bat. So we'll select that outer brow, and let's do our best to get it as close as possible, and then we'll flood smooth the area. So let's go to replace, cranked all the way to 0. We'll crank the opacity all the way to 1. Bring our brush tool out to about 2. So now we're going to flood smooth it. So we'll go to smooth and we'll flood it 5 or 6 times maybe. And let's select the cluster and see how it behaves. If I'm going to move this up and down, I probably want it to move a little bit more over here as well. So I'll just move it up and we'll paint that out a little bit. Alright, so we have that going up and down pretty smoothly. So the idea is basically after you apply the cluster and you've taken away all the weights around the edges, then you flood smooth it, and then you just use the add and smooth functions to refine the shape. We'll just set that back to 0, and we're going to do the mid-brow now. And this time I'm going to select the entire eyebrow for the mid-eyebrow control. We're going to use it to move the eyebrow up and down in the center, but we want to be able to rotate it as well, and we want it to affect both sides of the eyebrow. So we're going to get the whole eyebrow, and we'll just refine our selection here. Alright, because you can see that I went with a pretty large selection, and that's just so that I can have any bulgy areas sort of drop off. Let's go to our deform menu and we'll choose cluster. Alright, so this is going to be the left mid-brow cluster. Let's choose smooth here and we'll flood. I'm doing this about 8 or 10 times here. So now let's select our cluster and see how that looks. Okay. So you can see it's still affecting the center of the brow the most, but it's still moving the inner and outer a little bit, which is good. So if we rotate that one and Z, you can see that we can get some other expressions out of the eyebrow that way as well. Of course, we're going to refine this a little bit now. Once you get the eyebrow deforming nicely for the Y translations, usually it will rotate nicely as well. So let's just do the up first. Alright, so I just added a bunch of weights really quickly and it's over a large area. It's looking pretty lumpy, so I'm just going to go to smooth and we'll flood that. And then we can smooth specific areas as well. Alright, so let's click on our cluster and see how that looks. That's actually looking pretty smooth. Alright, so let's move it up and down. Alright, so I'm just finishing up weighting the mid-brow, and I'm just finishing smoothing up some of the lumpy areas up here. So I'll select that cluster and let's move it up and down, and I think this is fine. These clusters are going to be more for finer adjustments. Okay, so let's just zero out that cluster, make sure they're all zeroed out. So the next step, we're going to create some control curves to attach these clusters to. Let's go to show and turn our control curves back on. Turn on NURBS curves. Curves and surfaces. We'll create a circle and we'll just bring that right up closer to the face. We're going to create one control curve for each one of these clusters and parent constrain it. Alright, so we'll put the first one here, and now let's form that control a little bit. So I think that's fine. We'll hit F8 to go back to object mode. And I just want to center the pivot on that, so we're going to go to Modify, Center Pivot. Let's move it into place. We're going to have 3 of these here, so you don't want it too big so they're not colliding and running into each other. And I'm going to make 2 more, so we're going to use Control D on our keyboard to duplicate that. Now that I have all these placed, and I took some time to place them just perfectly, I'm going to need controls for the other side of the eyebrow as well. I know we haven't done our clusters yet, but since I have all these done, I might as well select all these now. And I want to get them to be the exact same on the other side. So I'm going to group these together into a group. So I'm going to hit Control G on my keyboard, and then we'll duplicate the group with Control D. Now we have two groups. I'm going to center the pivot of the second group, and we'll just bring that over. We're going to scale it in X with a -1. That will just flip it right around. So now I can translate that back over, and it fits our other eyebrow perfectly. So now we're going to clear history and freeze transformations on each one of these controls, and we're going to name them. So left inner brow, left mid brow, or we'll call it control, left middle brow control. We'll do the same thing for the other side. We might as well just name these while we're at it. Alright, so we have all of our right brow controls named. Now we're going to parent constrain each control to its cluster. So we'll select the control first, and we'll find the left inner brow cluster. Shift select that, so we have both selected. And we'll go to constrain, and we'll use a parent constraint. So now if we select the control, let's do the same thing with the mid and the outer. Test it, make sure it's working. Zero it back out, and let's do the outer. And we'll just test it really quick. Alright, so now we'll repeat the same process. We can turn these curves off. Let's go to Show and hide the NURBS curves. That will make it easier to paint the other brow. So we'll go through and do the same thing. We'll repeat the same process for painting the weights, and then we'll constrain the controls, which are already there. We can constrain the controls to the appropriate clusters. Alright, so I've gone through and I've added clusters for the right eyebrow, and I parent constrain the controls to each cluster. When you start to paint the other side, it's a great idea to bring the cluster that you're painting for the other side down as well, just so you can match it up as you're painting it, and just make sure that they're as close as possible to matching. Alright, so we're going to create two more clusters for the lower lids. Definitely want to include the corners of the eye here. So I'm just going to do a rough selection. So I think we got a little bit more than what we needed there, but that's totally fine. So let's just go and create the cluster. Go to the form, cluster, and let's name that one. Click on our weight painting tool here, and we'll go find that in the list. Left lower eyelid cluster, there it is. And we'll go ahead and do the same thing we've done before. We'll go to replace. Alright, so something like that should be good, and let's smooth flood that. So we'll select smooth and we'll flood it. So we'll select the cluster here. So let's change the pivot point, very similar to how we did the top eyelid. We can hold D down on our keyboard. It's a little better, but it's still sort of collapsing in on itself. So we have to move the pivot point up for this lower eyelid. So we'll hold D down again on our keyboard and just move it up. This is kind of a trial and error process. And we're getting a lot closer here. Let's turn the eyes on for a minute. And that's looking good. We have to experiment a little bit with the pivot point. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with that. Let's just refine the weights on this cluster a bit. Alright, so this is the corner of the eye. I want this to be a nice crease here. So I'm going to add a little bit of weight to the corners. Alright, now I'm going to make my brush real small and just sort of pop out some of these vertices here. Okay, now let's just smooth that out. No, I don't want to flood smooth this because it's going to undo some of the painting I did in the corners here, so we're just going to manually smooth that. Let's select the cluster now, and let's rotate it up and down and see how it looks. Alright, so I like how that's closing, and actually that's pretty good. I think I'm just going to refine this a little bit because it's going into the eyeball a little bit here, we can just move the pivot point to fix that. So let's just do that. You really want to look at it on the eye white. It looks like it's away from the eyeball here, but that's because we have some transparency on the eyeball in the center here. So it actually is gliding up nicely along the eyeball. So that is going to work just fine. And if we try to rotate it in Z, we can squeeze out some extra facial expressions this way as well. So we'll probably include that in our set-driven keys when we set up the controls for the eyelids. So now I'll run through and repeat the process for the right lower eyelid. So we're all done with clusters for the eyelids and the eyebrows. Now we're going to add some blend shapes to add some extra functionality to the eyebrows, just to get some real broad movements. So blend shapes are basically a copy of the character's head that we can mold and change into a different shape, and we can apply that shape to this model's head. So we already have his head separated from a previous class, so we'll just bring that over here. If it's locked, you can unlock it. Right now I have the translate Y and X unlocked here. You can see they're unlocked. But if you need to move it in Z, you can just right click and go unlock, just to unlock the translations. So I'll bring that down right above his head. You can bring it above or beside, it doesn't really matter. We're just going to work on this head for a little bit. So on this copy of the character's head, I'm going to get the one eyebrow down, and then I'll make another copy and we'll get the other eyebrow down, just so we can have individual controls, individual blend shapes of each eyebrow going down. And then we'll do another copy with one eyebrow up and another copy with the other eyebrow up. Before you even start creating blend shapes, you want to make sure that you always have this original model to work with. I'm going to make all my copies first and just set this to the side, and we're not even going to use this one. This one's just going to be an original copy that we can duplicate to make new blend shapes in the future. So I'm going to hold Control down and press D on my keyboard to make a duplicate. So we're going to need 4. 2 for the left brow up and down, and 2 for the right brow up and down. So there, we have 4 now. We're going to leave this one off to the side. We'll just move it up to the side and up so that if I want to look in my side view, it's not going to be in the way. Okay, so on the top heads, let's do the eyebrows up. So there's a couple different ways to modify your mesh. We can use a lattice, and we can use soft selections. And I think I'm going to use a combination of both. So let's just take a look at soft selections first. If you took the modeling class, you'll know what it is already. We right click over our model and we choose face. You can choose face, edge, or vertex, it doesn't really matter. But I'm going to choose face, and we'll just select one of these faces here on the brow. We can turn on soft selections 2 different ways. We can double click on our move tool. We already have our move tool up here. But under soft selection, we can drop that window down, and right under where it says soft select, you can just check that. You'll notice on your model that you have a gradient area, the hot spot's right in the middle, and then it drops off as it gets further away from your selection. So if I drag this face out now, there's a whole area of influence here that it takes with it. With soft selection off, we'll just drag that one face out. So it'd be extremely difficult to change your model that way. So we can increase the radius of this influence just by increasing the fall off radius here. I have it at 0.2 right now. So if we increase that to 0.5, let's say, for example, you can see it gets a lot larger. And now I can shape the eyebrow a little bit better. So if I select a larger area, if I select all the faces on the eyebrow here, we can drop the eyebrows down that way. There will be some tweaking to do after if we do it this way. Very similar to selecting an area of vertices and applying a cluster, we can select an area of vertices and apply a lattice. And a lattice is just a cage that allows us to change the model. So let's just say, for example, I select, but just to demonstrate how the lattice works, once you have your selection made, you can go to Deform, and you can just go right down to where it says Lattice. You'll see this cage appear around your selection. Now if we right click on the lattice and choose Lattice Point, you can see that we have lattice points, and they're like vertices. But now this whole cage is attached to your selection, and you can actually modify and deform your model this way. You can see that the model's being affected by just this one point, but you can grab multiple points by holding Shift down and affect your model this way. Now before soft selections, this was the most common way to change the model for blend shapes, but with soft selections it makes it a little bit easier to do it that way, and usually I'll use a combination of soft selections and a lattice. Alright, so to get out of the lattice points, you can just hit F8 on your keyboard a couple times to get back to object mode of the lattice. So if we go in the channel box on the right side, you can see we have our lattice shape here, and you can see we have divisions 2, 5, and 2. We can change that. You can see that the 5 is 5 horizontal divisions. We can change this one to, if we change it to 3, you can see it gives us more divisions. Now you want to be careful with that. You don't want to add too many divisions, because when you right click and go to lattice points, it gets really difficult to make deformations with all these lattices. You can see there's a whole bunch on the inside as well. So I wouldn't go too crazy with adding too many lattice points or too many divisions, because we'll end up with tons of points to edit. What I would keep in mind is, for example, say I am going to just select these 2 points and move the brows down. You can see how it's bringing the forehead down as well. But say I want to pin this area of the forehead so that I don't have to round it out later. We can just add a division here, 1 or even 2. These points are going to have influence on the head and sort of keep them pinned there. So now if I select these points and I want to bring the eyebrows down that way, you can see that it sort of keeps the top of the head up. I'm going to create 2 heads with the right eyebrow up and the left eyebrow up. Now it's a very time-consuming process, so I'm just going to speed through most of this and offer some tips along the way. I'm going to start with using soft selections first. That's just my preference, and then I'll use a lattice if I need it. You can see in the hypergraph that when you create the lattice, it creates 2 nodes. It gives you a lattice node and then a lattice base node. So we really are just going to delete both of those. So I'm going to start over here. I just wanted to demonstrate that for you. And so these are our down brows, and these will be our up brows. So I like to start with soft selection. So I'm going to go to face. And if you're going to do it this way as well, you'll have to continuously adjust this fall off radius. So this is the way I'm going to start my eyebrows up. I'm just going to select all the top faces of the eyebrow. I want to make sure that my fall off radius is at a number that's at a value that's not going to grab the lower eyelid. I don't want to bring the eyelid up with it. I already have eyelid controls that are going to do that. So I really just want to affect the eyebrow. So I want to get the middle of the eyebrow to kind of pop up a little bit. I'm going to start deselecting faces on either side of the brow. Maybe we'll do 2 at a time here. I think something like that should be good. Alright, I'm going to hit F8 on my keyboard to get out of component mode and just look at it. Alright, so I'm just going to make some small adjustments to this, and we'll move on to the other side. So this is our right eyebrow lift, and this will be our left eyebrow lift. Back to 0.5. I did change this a little bit when I was making the finer tweaks, but I'm going to put it back to 0.5 so I get the same result as I did on the other side. And you know what, before I go any further, it's probably a good idea just to move this over and bring it right next to the other one. And make sure, let's just go to the front view for a minute, hit F on the keyboard to focus in, and I want to make sure that they're the same height. So just use the grid there to just sort of eyeball it. And I'm going to put that right next to it so I can model the other one and try to match it up. Hit F8 to get out of component mode. Let's take a look. I'm just going to move them up and out of the way a little bit, and we'll work on the down eyebrows. The down eyebrows are a little more tricky because we have the eyelid to contend with, and we need to get a nice fold in here. Alright, so we'll stop it there, and I'm going to use a different technique now. I'm going to get out of component mode. We'll hit F8 on the keyboard. You can see that I've gotten it to a certain point, and if you get to a certain point like this and your mesh is a little bit tangled up here, or it's a little bit, so you can see that the mesh is sort of imperfect, we can use the sculpt tool to fix that. So if you go up to your sculpting shelf here, so we have a whole bunch of different sculpting options here, but we want to use the smooth sculpt. So if you hover over it, it should tell you which one it is. If it doesn't, you can look at the bottom here in Maya, at the bottom of the interface, it will tell you which one it is. Right now I'm just going to use the smooth tool, so I'm going to click on that, and then it gives me the smooth tool options. So we have our brush size and strength would be the two that I would adjust as I'm working here. So if we go over our model, we can see that the brush size is pretty big. I don't want to have it that large. So I'm just going to change the brush size to maybe 0.1, and we'll just leave the strength as it is for now. You can always reset the tool by pressing the reset tool button. So I'm just going to go over some of the areas where the mesh is just sort of uneven and just drag over those just to straighten out the mesh. We can decrease the strength if we find that it's changing the model too much. In the process of bringing the eyebrow down, it was sort of unavoidable. The eyelid became a little concave. So I can see that it's all concave still. It's smoothed it out, but it's still concave. So I'm just going to use my lift tool. So we'll click on that first one, and you can see what this one does. I'll just experiment on the outside of his head here for a minute. This is going to pull the mesh up. You can see that's pulling it up way too much. So I'm just going to Control Z to undo that, and I'll bring the strength way down. Let's try it again. So now it's just pulling it up a small amount. Again, that's way too strong for what I need. So I'm going to bring that down to 0.1. Bring the strength down to 0.1. I'm just clicking and popping up little areas, and then I'm going to go through and smooth that. So I'm just going to work on the outer and the inner eyebrow areas, just using our soft selection tool to bring some of the faces up a little bit, and then using the smooth tool to smooth out areas. Now I'm just going to drag that over to our other model, just somewhere close to it, just so we can try and match up the other eyebrow. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat the same process. So this is what I ended up with. We have a right and left eyebrow that is in an up position, and we have a right and left eyebrow that are in a lowered position. And we have our original head over here that we copied at the beginning, and we're not going to touch that one. We're just going to leave it there so that we can make duplicates of it whenever we need to create a new blend shape. So before I apply the blend shape, I'm just going to name these. I'm just going to call that original blend shape. I'm going to call this one left brow raise, right brow raise blend shape, left brow low, and right brow low. The easy part is actually applying the blend shape. So to do that, we select one of our models, then just shift select all the blend shapes. We select the blend shapes first. Then we shift select our model, and we go to deform, and it's the first one in the list here, blend shape. Let's go to the option box first. You want to make sure that you uncheck where it says check topology, and then we can just hit create. So to see how the blend shapes are working, let's go to Windows. We have to go to Animation Editors, and it's right at the bottom of the list. We'll go to blend shape, and it opens up this window. These are our blend shape controls, and we can see that we have a slider for each one of our blend shapes that we created, and we can rename them here. So if you drag the slider up, you can see the effect. You just go through and test each one, make sure they're working. Alright, so now that we have these blend shapes in, we can still use the clusters to tweak out the eyebrow shape a little bit. Okay, so I can see that's not working properly. So what's happening here, and this is a very important step, this skin has a bunch of different deformers on it now. We have clusters, and we have a blend shape. And it also has a skin cluster for the skin being bound to the skeleton. If you apply these deformers and you find that they're not functioning properly, you have to look at the inputs, and we have to adjust our deformation order. There's actually an order in which these deformers, these different deformers need to be in. So to do that, you just select the skin, polygon mesh, and we'll go up to here to this little button, click on that, and you go right to the bottom where it says all inputs, it'll open up a window. So we can see we have blend shapes at the very top, and then we have all of the clusters that we created. And then the skin cluster 1 is it's our skin weights being bound to the skeleton. So we want to bring our blend shapes down underneath the clusters. I'm just going to raise that up so we can see that it's not functioning properly. To change the deformation order here, you have to middle mouse button over one of these deformation names. So I'm going to bring that blend shape right down to the bottom. And as soon as I release, you can see that the blend shape's at the bottom here, and this popped up. So now it's functioning properly, and so are our blend shapes. So we can combine the blend shape movements with the cluster movements. It's great because we can get stuff that we couldn't get before. This should work just fine. We may need to move the skin cluster to the top later, but if we have any trouble, we'll adjust it then. Let's just shift select all these and let's zero these out. And I'm going to bring my blend shapes back down to normal. We're just going to close this up for now. We don't really need it anymore. We're going to use it in the next class when we rig the mouth. We should be able to get any brow expression that we need with these controls. So I'll just try a few. The main things I want to hit is make sure we can get them to look happy and sad, and then any variation in between. And again, these clusters are just to tweak out the brow shapes. So that'd be great for happy, something like that. And we want to make sure that we can get them to look sad as well. Test for angry as well. Alright, so the next thing we need to do is, I'm going to create a face control that we're going to place above his head. Just like we did with the hands, we added all these attributes, created set-driven keys for them. We're going to do the same thing with the face. Let's go to create, and we'll choose text. And I'm just going to use an F, create. I'm just going to place that above his head. So let's go to modify, and we'll center the pivot on it. And we're going to scale it up. Alright, so I want to go to edit and delete by type, and we'll go history. So clear any history on it, and we're going to go to modify and we'll freeze the transformations on it. Alright, so let's create our first attributes. We're going to create the attributes for the eyelids. So we'll go to modify, add attribute. I'm going to do a displayable attribute that is just going to be like a title head. So I'm just going to call this, we'll call it standard blink. Add. Now we're going to actually create the keyable attribute, and we'll call this one, we'll just call it blink. And we'll leave it on keyable. So this will be to blink and to open the eyes really wide. So the minimum can be -10. We're just going to go with -10 and 10. And we'll leave the default on 0, and that'll be where his eyes are now, just the default. Add that. Alright, so now we're going to create another title, displayable attribute, and we'll call this one upper lids. Click on add. And then for upper lids, let's do right upper lid, and we'll do -10 and 10 for maximum. We'll add that, and we'll create an attribute for left upper lid. We're always going to just keep it with a minimum of -10 and a maximum of 10. Now let's create another displayable attribute as a title for lower lids. And then we'll create an attribute, a keyable attribute now for right lower lid and left lower lid. Remember how we could rotate the lids to get angry and sad looks? So I'm going to create some attributes for the lid rotates. So we're going to do upper lid rotates, lower lid rotates. Alright, so let's close that up. We have all the attributes we need. I'm just looking at our list here, and our titles kind of blend in with our attributes. So let's actually see if we can capitalize these. So let's go to modify. Let's go to edit attribute, and we'll go to where it says standard blink, and let's just turn our caps on for a minute. So you just, where it says new name, you can just adjust the name. I just decided to make them capitals just so that our titles stand out a little more, and you can see it updates. Alright, so we'll do the same thing where we have the grayed out attribute there. It's just a title. Okay, so there we go. Our titles are all in capitals. This is just purely aesthetics, totally not necessary, but it just looks nicer. Okay, and I realized I haven't named this phase control, so I'm just going to click on the title of it in the channel box here and just name it phase control. Alright, so now let's set up our set-driven keys. We have to change our menu set to animation, and then we're going to go to key. Let's go down to set-driven key, and we'll move over to where it says set. This opens up our set-driven key window. The phase control is going to be our driver, so make sure you have your phase control selected, and we'll click on load driver. And now I want to set up some set-driven keys for the blinks, and we want to select where it says blink because we're going to set up the standard blink first. Now let's select the cluster for the blink, and we'll hit load driven. Let's click on the rotate X attribute here, the translate Z as well. We'll select the translate Z and the rotate, so this is just so that we can translate it back as well. So let's hit key. Now it's keying the translate Z and the rotate X. And we'll set our blink to -10. And let's select the cluster. And let's rotate it back up in X. As high as we can go before it starts to deform. And let's translate it back in Z now. Just so it hugs the eyeball nicely there. And we'll hit key again. Now if we select the face control, we select our blink attribute, and if we drag, we should get the eye going from default to wide open. Okay, so that's set. Now let's drag the blink attribute to 10, and we'll select the cluster again, and now let's close the eye. It would be great just to translate that cluster over a little bit, just to get the eye to shut perfectly, and maybe even translate it down. So I'm feeling like maybe I should include all the translates in this set-driven key. So I'm just going to undo that. Let's make sure our cluster is back to 0. Let's go to the face control. And let's set the blink back to 0 again. I'm just going to select all the translates and all the rotates just in case I need to key those as well. So we'll key that. We'll set the blink to -10 again. And let's just make sure we key it again just so we get all the translates and rotates. And now we'll set the blink to 10. So now we can bring the eye closed. You can see all the translates and rotates have a connection, they're keyed there. Alright, so let's close the eye now. And then I'll just translate it, or move it over a little just to shut the eye completely there. So now we'll key that. And now when we select our face control, we should have the left side blinking nicely. We're going to keep our driver on blink, and we're going to do the same thing for the right eye. And that way this blink control will just control both eye blinks. And then when this character is being animated, it'll be really easy just to get him to blink. So now if we go to our face control, we should have our standard blinks all set up. And I'm going to continue setting set-driven keys for the individual upper lids, individual lower lids, and upper lid rotates and lower lid rotates. So just to get started here, I'm going to change the driver part of our set-driven key window. I'm going to change this to upper lid, right upper lid. We always have to change that when we're going to create the next set-driven key for the next attribute. And then we have to select the right upper lid cluster, and we'll make sure it's already loaded, but I'm just going to hit load driven again just in case. And let's just select all the translates and rotates again, and we'll key it. And we'll do the -10. And I'm just going to do the same thing I did with the blinks. I'm just going to bring it up, translate it back a little bit, just so it hugs the eyeball. And key that, and then we're going to go back to the face control and do the same thing. Just repeat the process, and we're going to close that up. And we'll key it. So now we have our individual right upper lid attribute set. So I'm just going to repeat the process for this side. We have to don't forget you have to change your attribute here in the set-driven key window. So we can get all kinds of expression out of his face now. So now we have to set up the set-driven keys for the eyebrows. So we'll go back to modify, open up our add attribute window, and let's create a title or a displayable attribute for the eyebrows moving up and down. We'll just call this, and we'll call it eyebrows up down, and we'll add that. And now we'll create a keyable attribute for the left eye and right eye. We'll just call this one right eyebrow, and we're going to do a minimum and maximum. So minimum will probably be down, and maximum will be up, -10 and 10, and we'll add that one. We'll do another one for the left eyebrow. Alright, so we'll go to Windows and Animation Editors, and let's open up our blend shape window. And here we have the blend shapes for the eyebrows that we did earlier. We'll open up our set-driven key window again. With our face control selected, we'll hit load driver, and we'll go right to the bottom and we'll select the right eyebrow. And we need to load our driven. So we're just going to hit the select button here to select our blend shapes, and we'll hit load driven. And as soon as we hit load driven, you can see all of our different blend shapes here. Now since we're doing the right eyebrow, hold down control and select both the right eyebrow blend shapes, and we'll hit key. And you can see it sets a key on the blend shapes, and that's just setting a key on the default position. So let's select our face control, go to the right eyebrow, and we'll go down to -10. So that'll be our down position. And let's move the right eyebrow down to its down position. And we'll key that. Then we'll select our face control again, Let's change our right eyebrow attribute to 10. We'll drag it up in the blend shape window, and then we'll key that again. If we select our right eyebrow attribute now and we virtual slide it, so now this attribute controls the eyebrow movement for up and down. So now we need to do the left eyebrow. So make sure that we change the driver attribute here to left eyebrow, and we'll just shift select our left eyebrow under the driven part of the set driven key window, and we can key that now. So it keys it at its default position, and let's change the left eyebrow attribute to -10, and we'll bring that left eyebrow down to the -10 value and key it. Now we'll change the left eyebrow attribute to +10, and we'll bring it up, and we'll key that. So if we select both these attributes, we can bring them both up and both down together or individually. That's it for eyes and brows. In the next class, we'll be rigging the mouth for speech and facial expressions.